My name is Claire, and for 11 years I have smiled through Thanksgiving dinners where I was seated at the far end of the table, near the kitchen door, like the help. I have laughed along with jokes about my community college degree, which is, for the record, an associate's degree in accounting that I finished while working 2 jobs. I have nodded politely while my mother-in-law, Margaret, explained to house guests that her son Daniel could have done so much better. For 11 years, I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that Daniel loved me, that our life together was good, that Margaret's opinion of me was her problem, not mine. I told myself a lot of things to get through a lot of Sunday dinners, but I want to start this story somewhere else. Not at the party. Not yet. I want to start 5 years ago, in a lawyer's office in a strip mall next to a dry cleaner, on a Tuesday afternoon when nobody in my husband's family knew where I was. Let me back up further, actually. Let me tell you who I am, because it matters for what comes later. I grew up outside Dayton, Ohio, the daughter of a machinist and a woman who cleaned houses on the weekends to help cover the mortgage. We didn't have money, but we had dinner together every night. And my mother used to say the same thing to me before every test, every job interview, every hard conversation. Claire, nobody can take away what you build with your own 2 hands. I didn't understand what she meant until much later. I do now. I met Daniel in my late 20s at a community fundraiser for a literacy program I volunteered with. He was kind in a way that surprised me. Not performative kindness, the real thing. He listened when I talked. He remembered small details about my life that I hadn't expected anyone to hold on to. We dated for 2 years before he introduced me to his mother. And looking back, I think some part of him already knew how that introduction would go. Margaret Whitfield, and yes, she goes by her maiden name professionally, a fact she's mentioned to me more than once as though it were a badge of some kind, comes from what she calls an established Cincinnati family. Her late husband, Daniel's father, built a successful regional trucking company from the ground up, and though he passed away when Daniel was in college, Margaret has spent the years since guarding the family's social standing like a woman defending a fortress. Country club memberships, charity gala committees. A very specific way of saying the word background that always seemed to land, somehow, exactly on me. The first time I met her, she looked at my hands. I'd had a manicure that chipped on the drive over, nerves, I suppose, and said, "Well, at least you clean up presentable." I laughed it off. Daniel apologized later, said she was just direct, said she'd warm up. She never warmed up. Not in 11 years. I want to be fair here, because I've had a long time to think about this story, and I don't want to make Margaret into a cartoon. She was not cruel to me in dramatic, obvious ways. She never screamed at me, never threw anything, never said something so awful I could point to it and say, "There, that's the moment. That's unforgivable." Her weapon was smaller and, in some ways, more effective than that. It was the comment dropped casually at dinner. The joke that wasn't quite a joke. The way she'd introduce me to her friends as Daniel's wife, and then pause, as if waiting for someone to ask what I did for a living, so she could answer for me in a tone that made bookkeeping sound like something shameful. "She does the books for a little bakery," Margaret told her book club once, while I stood 4 feet away holding a tray of appetizers. Very sweet, very practical. I want to tell you that I confronted her. I want to tell you I stood up for myself every single time. I didn't. I was raised to be polite, to not make scenes, to let things go for the sake of peace, especially family peace, especially Daniel's peace. because I could see what it cost him every time his mother said something cutting about me. He'd get this tight look around his jaw, and later, in the car, he'd apologize, and I'd tell him it was fine. And we'd drive home in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable and wasn't quite a fight either. Here's the thing about Margaret that most people at that party 5 years ago, the birthday party I'll tell you about soon, did not know. Margaret's second husband, a man named Robert she married 8 years after Daniel's father died, left her in a financial mess most people would never recover from. Robert had convinced her to co-sign on a series of business loans for a restaurant venture that failed spectacularly. When he left, and he did leave, 6 months after the restaurant closed, taking what savings were left in a joint account, Margaret was 62 years old, facing foreclosure on the house she'd lived in for over a decade, with a credit score in ruins and a pride too large to ask her son for help directly. Daniel found out almost by accident, going through mail that had been forwarded to our address by a bank error. He was devastated. Not for the money. Daniel has never cared much about money, which is one of the things I love about him. But because his mother, a woman who had spent her whole life curating an image of composure and status, was about to lose her home and hadn't told a single member of her family. I remember the night Daniel told me. He sat at our kitchen table with his head in his hands and said, "I don't know what to do, Claire. She won't take money from me. She says it would be humiliating. She'd rather lose the house than admit she needs help." And here is where I want you to understand something about me. Something I've never fully explained to anyone in Daniel's family, not even Daniel's sister, who is the only one of them who has ever treated me like an actual person. I did not grow up with money, but I grew up watching my mother clean other people's houses so we could keep our own. And I grew up understanding that dignity and pride are not the same thing. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is help them keep the difference between those two things intact. I had, by that point, spent almost a decade building something of my own. Not glamorous, not a trucking empire. I run a small bookkeeping and tax preparation firm. The Little Bakery Books lady, as Margaret liked to characterize it, had actually grown, by that time, into a firm with 4 employees and a client list of 40 small businesses across 3 counties. I'd built it from a card table in our spare bedroom. I had savings. I had, more importantly, an idea. I told Daniel I wanted to buy the house, not for us, not to move into. I wanted to buy his mother's house, quietly, through a limited liability company with a name that meant nothing to anyone. Hearthstone Properties, a name I picked specifically because it was boring. And then let her stay in it, rent-free, no strings. She would never have to know it was me. As far as Margaret would know, a private investor, or the bank restructured things, or whatever cover story we could construct had saved her home. Daniel cried when I told him. He asked me why I would do that for a woman who had spent years being unkind to me. I told him the truth, which is that I wasn't doing it for her. I was doing it for him. And I was doing it because of what my mother taught me. That what you build with your own hands is yours to do with as you choose. And I chose, in that moment, to protect an old woman's dignity, even though she had never once tried to protect mine. We told Margaret a version of the truth that protected her pride, that Daniel had worked something out with the bank through a business contact, that the house had been transferred to a holding company that would let her stay as long as she needed at a token rent. Daniel quietly covered himself, though in reality, I paid every property tax bill, every major repair, every homeowner's insurance premium for 5 years out of an account Margaret never saw and never asked about, because asking would have meant admitting she needed it. 5 years. 5 years of Margaret living in that house, hosting her book club there, hosting Easter there, telling her friends about the family home, a home she did not, in any legal sense, own, while continuing, almost without pause, to make comments about how I had married her son beneath his station. I never told her. I never held it over her. I never once, in 5 years, said a single word about it. Not at Christmas, not at Daniel's birthday, not the time she told a table full of guests that she worried about the children Daniel and I might have, given my side of the family's background. A comment so breathtakingly cruel that I had to leave the room to keep from crying in front of everyone. I kept the deed in a safe deposit box at my bank, in a manila folder, and I told myself I would never need to use it. I told myself I was doing this because it was right, not because I might someday need leverage. I was wrong about that last part. Not about doing what was right. I still believed that was right. I was wrong that I would never need it, because 5 years later, at Margaret's 60th birthday party, in a private room at the Cincinnati Country Club that Daniel and I had paid $11,000 to reserve and cater, Margaret stood up in front of 80 guests, raised her champagne glass, and said the sentence that changed everything. The party was, by every external measure, a triumph. Margaret had insisted on the country club, of course. Nowhere else would do for a milestone birthday, she said. And Daniel, wanting to give his mother something nice, had not argued. I hadn't argued either. I'd spent 3 weeks coordinating with the events team, tasting cake samples, arranging for Margaret's favorite string quartet to play during cocktail hour, tracking down a photographer Margaret liked from a wedding she'd attended 2 years earlier. I did all of this the way I do everything for this family. Quietly, competently, and without expecting to be thanked. The room was beautiful. Ivory linens, gold accents, a wall of white peonies behind the head table that had cost more than my first car. 80 guests, Margaret's book club, her charity board colleagues, old friends from the country club's tennis league, cousins and second cousins I'd met maybe twice, and of course, Daniel's sister Louise, who flew in from Seattle and who is, I want to be clear, one of the genuinely good people in this story. I wore a navy dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. Modest, well-tailored, nothing flashy. I had learned over 11 years exactly how to dress for these events. Small enough not to draw comment. Nice enough not to embarrass Daniel. I had my hair done. I smiled at everyone. I made small talk about the weather and the peonies and how lovely Margaret looked in her sapphire gown. Dinner went well. The band played. Margaret danced with Daniel to a song that had been her song with Daniel's late father. And I watched from our table and felt, genuinely, a small swell of warmth for her, the woman who had lost so much and rebuilt a version of a life that looked, from the outside, entirely intact. I thought, not for the first time, that maybe tonight would be different. Maybe 60 would soften something in her. Maybe this milestone would be the one where she finally said something kind to me in front of other people. Toward the end of the evening, after the cake had been cut and the coffee served, Daniel's Uncle Richard tapped a spoon against his glass and called for toasts. A few people spoke. Louise gave a genuinely lovely tribute to her mother, funny and warm, and I remember squeezing Daniel's hand under the table because his sister has always known how to say the things that matter. Then Margaret rose to her feet. She'd had, I'll note, several glasses of champagne by that point. Not drunk exactly. Margaret does not get sloppy drunk. She gets a particular kind of loose-tongued, overconfident version of herself that I had learned over the years to be wary of. She stood at the head table in her sapphire gown, glass raised, and the room quieted the way rooms do when someone important is about to speak. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight," she began, and her voice had that warm, practiced quality she used for charity speeches, the tone that made people lean in. 60 years. I never imagined I'd get here, and getting here has taught me a few things about what really matters in life. Family, legacy, standards. A few appreciative murmurs from the crowd. I remember feeling at that moment a small tightening in my chest, a warning I'd learned to recognize over a decade of watching Margaret build towards something. "I want to raise a glass to my son," she continued, turning toward Daniel with a smile that looked, to everyone else in that room, like maternal pride. Daniel has always been the kind of man who follows his heart, even when his heart takes him somewhere his family might not have chosen for him. The room laughed, lightly, the way rooms laugh at something they don't yet understand is a setup. "Let's toast," Margaret said, raising her glass higher, "to my son, who married beneath his station." I want to describe as precisely as I can what happened in the 3 seconds after those words left her mouth, because I have replayed those 3 seconds more times than I can count. There was a beat of confused silence, the kind that happens when a joke needs a half-second to be processed. And then, laughter. Not everyone, maybe a third of the room, the ones closest to Margaret, her book club friends, a cousin who'd always been cold to me, chuckling into their champagne glasses as though this were simply Margaret being Margaret, delightfully candid, the way she always was. I looked at Daniel. His face had gone white, then red, his jaw tightening in that way I knew so well, the way that meant he was furious and trying not to show it in front of a room full of his mother's friends. He started to stand. I remember his hand moving to push back his chair, and I put my hand on his arm, not to stop him from defending me, but because I needed, in that moment, one more second to think. I looked around the table. Louise's face had gone the same shade of horrified red as her brother's. A woman I didn't know, 2 tables over, actually gasped audibly and then tried to disguise it as a cough. Uncle Richard was staring into his glass like he wished it were deeper. And I looked at Margaret, still standing, still smiling, glass raised, entirely unaware, or entirely unbothered, I genuinely could not tell which, that she had just said something breathtaking in its cruelty, in a room full of 80 people, on camera, because the photographer I had hired was standing not 10 feet away, capturing the whole thing. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters more than what I did next. I did not feel rage exactly. I have felt rage before, small flares of it over the years, always swallowed, always smoothed over for the sake of peace. What I felt, standing there in my navy dress with my champagne glass in my hand, was something quieter and colder. It was clarity. 11 years. 11 years of small cuts, of comments about my background, of being introduced as an afterthought, of watching this woman live for 5 years in a house I quietly bought to save her from homelessness. All while she stood in rooms like this one and made me into a punchline. I did not flinch. I want that understood clearly. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene of the kind Margaret, I think, half expected and would have used against me for years afterward. Do you remember when Claire made a scene at my 60th? I set down my glass. I set it down slowly, deliberately, on the white tablecloth, and I felt Daniel's hand find mine under the table, gripping it, and I understood in that grip that he was giving me something. Not permission exactly, because I didn't need his permission, but solidarity. The promise that whatever happened next, he was with me. I reached down to my handbag, resting against the leg of my chair, and I opened it. I need to pause the party here for a moment, because I want you to understand something. I had brought the folder with me that night. Not because I had planned to use it. I had genuinely, truly believed, hoped at least, that tonight would not be the night. But I want to be honest with you about something else, too. About 6 weeks before the party, something had happened that made me start carrying that folder to family events. Just in case. Daniel and I had hosted Easter that year at our house, and Margaret had spent a portion of the afternoon telling a story to a cluster of guests. Louise's husband, a cousin, 2 of Daniel's old college friends, about how she'd always known Daniel would eventually come to his senses, and that she still held out hope, even after 11 years of marriage, that things would work out the way they were meant to. I understood, and I think everyone in that circle understood, exactly what she meant. She meant she was still waiting for Daniel to leave me. I hadn't said anything that day either. I had gone into the kitchen, run the water so no one would hear, and cried for exactly 90 seconds, the way I'd trained myself to do over the years. Fast, contained, invisible. And then I'd dried my face and gone back out to refill the deviled egg platter. That night, after everyone left, I told Daniel I couldn't keep doing this. Not the marriage. Never the marriage. I want to be clear, Daniel has never been the problem in this story. But the silence, the absorbing, the 11 years of making myself smaller so his mother's fragile sense of family superiority could stay intact. Daniel had said something to me that night that I've held on to ever since. He said, "You've spent 5 years protecting a woman who has never once tried to protect you. I don't know how you've done that. I don't think I could have." And I told him the truth, which is that I hadn't done it for her. I had done it because it was the right thing to do, and because I believed, genuinely believed, that the right thing doesn't stop being right just because the person receiving it doesn't deserve it. But I also told him something else that night, something I hadn't fully admitted to myself until I said it out loud. I told him I was tired. Tired of being the person who absorbs. Tired of being generous in secret while being humiliated in public. I told him that if his mother ever crossed a line publicly, not a private dig, not a passive comment, but a real, public, deliberate humiliation, I would not stay silent anymore. He'd nodded. He understood. And a week later, without my asking, he drove to the bank with me, and we took the folder, the deed, the LLC paperwork, 5 years of property tax receipts and insurance statements, all of it, out of the safe deposit box, and I started keeping it in a slim leather folder in the bottom of my everyday handbag. I told myself it was just in case. I told myself I probably would never need it. I brought it to the birthday party because some part of me, some quiet instinct that had been sharpening over 11 years of small cruelties, told me that a milestone birthday, several glasses of champagne deep, in front of 80 witnesses, was exactly the kind of setting where Margaret's guard might slip enough to say the thing she'd always thought but never quite said out loud. I was right. I want to tell you a little more about the house itself, because I think it matters to understand exactly what I was about to do and why it wasn't cruelty, or at least why I don't believe it was cruelty, even though I understand why some people, hearing this story secondhand, might think it was. The house is a 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet street in a neighborhood called Hyde Park. The kind of house with a wraparound porch and mature oak trees, and a kitchen Margaret had renovated twice over the years, each time telling her friends about her eye for design. It is worth, today, close to $900,000. When I bought it through Hearthstone Properties 5 years ago, it was worth about $610,000, and Margaret owed $480,000 on a mortgage she could no longer pay, with a second lien from the failed restaurant venture stacked on top. I paid off both, in full, quietly. I've never told anyone in that family the exact number, and I won't tell you either, except to say that it represented, at the time, nearly everything I had built in my business up to that point, plus a business loan I took out against my firm's future earnings, a loan I have been paying off, alongside everything else, for the last 5 years. I did this for a woman who, 3 weeks before her 60th birthday party, told a room full of guests she was still hoping her son would come to his senses and leave me. I want you to sit with that contrast for a moment, because I certainly have. So when Margaret raised her glass and said the words, "married beneath his station," in front of 80 people, in a room I had paid to decorate with peonies for her, in a life she was living in a house she did not know I owned, something in me that had been bending for 11 years finally, quietly, without drama, reached its limit. I opened my handbag. I found the folder, and I stood up. The room was still half laughing, half uncomfortable, the kind of atmosphere where people don't know yet whether they're allowed to be shocked or whether they should keep smiling in case this is all somehow fine. I stood up slowly. I am not by nature a person who commands a room. I have spent my whole adult life being the person who blends into the background of other people's spotlights. But something about the stillness with which I rose made the room quiet down on its own. Guest by guest, table by table, the way silence spreads. Margaret was still standing at the head table, glass raised, a little confused now, I think, by the shift in the room's energy, though not yet alarmed. She looked at me with an expression I'd come to know well over 11 years, a kind of mild, indulgent curiosity, as if she were waiting to see what small, forgettable thing I might say in response, something she could smile through and move past. "Margaret," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, not loud. I didn't need it to be loud, because the room had gone quiet enough that everyone could hear me without effort. Thank you for that toast. I think it's important, on a night about family and legacy, that we're all honest with each other. So I want to be honest with you. I saw Daniel go very still beside me. I saw Louise's hand come up to her mouth. 5 years ago, I continued, when Robert left and the restaurant failed, and the bank sent the first foreclosure notice on this house, the house you've hosted this family in for 5 Christmases, 5 Easters, God knows how many book club meetings. You told everyone that Daniel had worked something out with the bank, that a business contact had helped restructure things. Margaret's smile had started to falter. I watched her glass lower an inch, then 2. That wasn't true, I said. There was no bank restructuring. There was no business contact. What happened is that I paid off your mortgage in full, along with the second lien from the restaurant, through a holding company I set up so you would never have to know it was me. I have paid every property tax bill on that house for 5 years, every insurance premium, every major repair, including, I believe, a new roof 2 years ago that you told your book club was covered under warranty. I reached into the folder and pulled out the top document, the deed itself. Hearthstone Properties, LLC, listed as the owner. My name, listed as the LLC's sole member. Notarized, dated, unmistakable. And I set it on the table in front of her, next to her champagne glass. The room had gone completely silent. Not the awkward, half-laughing silence from a few minutes earlier. A real silence. The kind where you can hear silverware settle and someone's chair creak 3 tables back. "I want to be clear," I said, and I looked around the room now, not just at Margaret, because I realized, somewhere in that moment, that I wasn't only speaking to her anymore. "I did this because I love your son, and because watching you lose your home would have destroyed him, and because I still believe, that helping someone doesn't require them to deserve it. I have never once, in 5 years, mentioned this to you, not at any dinner, not during any comment about my background, or my degree, or my station. I let you keep your pride, even while you spent every occasion like this one chipping away at mine." Margaret's face had gone through several colors by this point. Pale, then a blotchy red climbing up her neck, her mouth opening slightly as though she were trying to construct a sentence and finding nothing there. "So," I said, and I picked the deed back up, folding it carefully. "Speaking of station, you have 30 days to find a new one." I want to describe the silence that followed, because I have never, before or since, experienced anything like it. 80 people in a room, and I don't think a single one of them breathed for what felt like a full 10 seconds. Somewhere near the back, I heard a glass set down on a table with a small, terrible clink, the only sound in the room. Margaret's mouth opened, closed, opened again. That's not... "Daniel, tell her," she started, turning to her son, looking for the rescue she had always been able to count on, the family loyalty that had, for 11 years, meant Daniel gently smoothing over her comments, apologizing on her behalf, absorbing the tension so nobody had to have the conversation everyone in that room, I think, had secretly wanted to have for years. Daniel stood up beside me. He did not raise his voice either. That's something I want you to understand about my husband. He is not a man who explodes. He is a man who, when he finally decides to speak, speaks with a stillness that somehow carries more weight than shouting ever could. "Mom," he said, "everything Claire just told you is true. I've known for 5 years. I helped her hide it from you because she asked me to, because she wanted you to keep your dignity." He paused. "I think tonight you've made it very clear you don't actually value hers." I don't think I will ever forget Margaret's face in that moment. Not because it was cruel of us to watch her absorb it, but because it was the first time in 11 years I had ever seen her look genuinely afraid. The party did not recover. I want to say that plainly because I know some people, hearing this story, wonder whether there was a version where everyone laughed it off and moved on to the DJ playing Celebration. There wasn't. Uncle Richard quietly signaled the band to wrap up. Louise came around the table and hugged me, hard, and whispered, "Thank you. Thank you, God. Someone finally said it," which told me something I long suspected, that I was not the only person in that family who had been keeping score of Margaret's cruelties. Just the only one who'd finally produced the receipts. Guests filtered out over the next 20 minutes in that particular stilted way people leave a party that has gone badly. Too many, "Well, we should get going," and not enough eye contact. A few of Margaret's book club friends stayed close to her, forming a small, protective cluster, throwing occasional glares in my direction as if I were the villain of the evening. I understood that. I understood that to people who had known Margaret for 30 years as a gracious, generous, impeccably composed woman, what they'd just witnessed didn't fit the story they'd built about her. And it's always easier to be angry at the person who broke the story than to sit with the possibility that the story was wrong. Daniel and I drove home in silence that night, but it was a different silence than the ones we'd shared after other family dinners over the years. It wasn't tense. It was, I think, the silence of two people who had just watched something shift permanently, both trying to understand what came next. "Did I go too far?" I asked him, once we were home, sitting at our kitchen table, the same table where he'd cried 5 years earlier, telling me about the foreclosure notice. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "I think you went exactly far enough. I think I should have gone that far years ago. And I didn't, because I was scared of what it would do to the family. But Claire, you're my family. You've been my family for 11 years, and I let my mother treat you like an outsider in it because I didn't want to rock a boat that honestly should have capsized a long time ago. I want to tell you that everything was simple after that, but it wasn't. The next 30 days were some of the hardest of our marriage, not because Daniel and I disagreed, but because watching someone you love navigate a genuine, painful reckoning with a parent is its own kind of hard, even when you believe, as I did, that the reckoning was earned. Margaret called Daniel 11 times over the following week. She did not call me. She has never, in 11 years, called me directly for anything, which tells you something on its own. She left voicemails ranging from icy formality, "Daniel, I think we need to discuss the arrangements for the house," to genuine tears. "I don't understand how you could let her do this to me. I'm your mother," to, on the 9th call, something that sounded, for the first time in 11 years, like an actual apology, though a stunted, half-formed one. I suppose I've said things over the years that weren't kind. I didn't think they mattered that much. Daniel did not immediately cave, and I want to give him real credit for that because I know how hard it must have been. He told his mother, gently but firmly, that the 30-day timeline stood, not out of cruelty, we clarified, but because I was no longer willing to subsidize, invisibly, a life that included public humiliation as one of its features. He told her that I had, however, already begun researching more modest condominium options in her price range, because despite everything, neither Daniel nor I actually wanted Margaret out on the street. We wanted her out of the pattern. Those are different things. Louise, for her part, became an unexpected ally during those weeks. She flew back out for a weekend, ostensibly to help her mother start packing, but really, I think, to have a series of long overdue conversations with her about the last decade. She told me later, over coffee, that she'd had no idea about the house, that Margaret had, apparently, told even her a version of the bank restructuring story, and that learning the truth had cracked something open in how she saw her mother's carefully curated image of composure and control. She spent her whole life terrified of looking like she needs help, Louise told me. I think that's why she was so awful to you, honestly. You're proof that needing help isn't shameful. You quietly gave her the biggest help of her life, and she couldn't stand what that meant about her. I don't know if that's the whole truth of why Margaret treated me the way she did for 11 years. I'm not a therapist, and I've stopped trying to fully diagnose her motivations. Some wounds are simply not mine to heal. But I found something clarifying in Louise's theory, something that let me hold both truths at once. That Margaret's cruelty was real and had cost me real pain, and that it likely came from somewhere small and frightened inside her, not from a place of strength. Extended family reacted in a range of ways I hadn't fully anticipated. A cousin sent me a long, apologetic text, admitting she'd always known Margaret's comments about my background were a bit much, and regretted laughing along at the party. Uncle Richard, of all people, called Daniel to say he thought the whole thing had been a long time coming, and that his own late brother, Daniel's father, would never have tolerated the way Margaret spoke about family. A different cousin stopped speaking to me entirely, apparently under the impression I had humiliated an elderly woman for sport, which stung, I'll admit, even though I knew it wasn't true. The 30 days passed. Margaret found a condo, a nice one actually, smaller than the house, but bright and well located, closer to her book club friends and the country club she loved so much. I want to be honest, I helped her find it. Not because the 30-day deadline softened out of guilt, but because I had never wanted her homeless, only accountable. And those are, again, different things. I sent Daniel listings. I never spoke to Margaret directly about any of it. That distance, I think, was necessary for both of us. It has been 4 months now since the party. Margaret is settled in her new condo. I have been there exactly once for a brief visit with Daniel, standing in the doorway of a place with good light and a small balcony, watching her arrange a shelf of framed photographs. Her late husband, Daniel as a boy, Louise's wedding, into a configuration she seemed satisfied with. She did not thank me that day. I did not expect her to. But she did, for the first time in 11 years, ask me a question about my business, how the firm was doing, whether I'd expanded, and let me answer without interrupting or redirecting the conversation back to herself. It was small. It was, for Margaret, enormous. I don't know if Margaret and I will ever be close. I've made a kind of peace with that possibility. What has changed, and changed permanently, is something quieter and, I think, more important. I am no longer willing to make myself smaller to protect someone else's comfort. Daniel is no longer willing to let anyone, including his own mother, speak about his wife as though she were a disappointment to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Louise and I talk every week now, something that never happened before the party. She told me recently that watching me set that deed down on the table was the first time in her life she'd seen someone hold a boundary with their mother with total calm. No shouting, no tears, just fact after fact, laid out like a closing argument. She said it changed how she thinks about her own relationship with Margaret, about the small accommodations she'd made over the years, without ever noticing she was making them. I think about my mother a lot these days. The woman who cleaned other people's houses on weekends and told me, before every hard thing I ever faced, that nobody can take away what you build with your own 2 hands. I understand now what she meant, more fully than I did at 22, sitting for a test I was nervous about. She didn't just mean money or property or a business built from a card table in a spare bedroom. She meant dignity. She meant the quiet, private knowledge of your own worth, built slowly, held firmly, and never, not for 11 years of small cruelties, not for one devastating toast at a country club, surrendered to someone else's idea of your station. I still have the folder. I keep it in the same slim leather case at the bottom of my handbag, though I don't imagine I'll ever need to produce it again. I keep it, I think, as a reminder, not of the party, not of Margaret's face going pale under the peony wall, but of the moment I finally understood that generosity and self-respect were never supposed to be opposites. I had spent 5 years being generous in secret while allowing myself to be diminished in public, and it took one champagne-soaked toast at a 60th birthday party to teach me that you can hold both the kindness and the boundary at the exact same time. That night, driving home from the party, Daniel reached over and took my hand at a red light, the same way he had under the table when his mother was still standing, glass raised, waiting for a laugh she would never quite get back. "Cheers," he said quietly, almost to himself, "to the last time anyone underestimates you." I laughed, really laughed, for the first time that whole night, and I thought about my mother's hands, cracked and tired from other people's houses, and about the deed folded neatly in my handbag, and about the quiet, steady work of building something no one can take from you. Some inheritances come with a name on a will. Mine came from a woman who scrubbed floors on Saturdays and taught her daughter that a station in life isn't given to you by someone else's toast. It's built, quietly, by your own two hands. And once it's built, no one, not a mother-in-law, not 80 country club guests, not a lifetime of small cruelties, gets to hand it back to you as an insult ever again.